Let me now introduce to you the one Canadian political party leader that stood for freedom the entire time, Maxime Bernier.
Thank you, Ezra. Thank you very much. I'm very happy and very pleased to be here. So, friends and fellow Canadians, first, thank you, Ezra, and also to your team for inviting me to this conference. Many, as you may know, many of the other speakers will discuss what has been the most important topic for almost 3 years now: the virus and the government's responses. At this point, I really hope that you know where I stand. And since I probably agree with everything, almost everything, coming from my esteemed colleagues, that they will say today about that virus. So for me, I'm not going to talk about this today. Instead, I wish to speak about another object of mass hysteria. That is the globalist leftists and the government that are trying to tell us that, the war in Ukraine and the Canada's positions regarding it should be. We have a different point of view than the government. All of that, I think it is important to make a point there. And let me express my deepest sympathy and for the innocent Ukrainians and also Russian men, women, and children caught in the middle of that terrible conflict. We should do other things. And it is said that about 100,000 soldiers have been killed, and on both sides, and also a number that will unfortunately, very likely, continue to climb. So, as with wars of the past, the justification and motivations are countless, but the results are nevertheless tragic. What I would like to explain today is the larger geopolitical context in which this war is taking place. Even though one country, Russia, clearly invaded another country, Ukraine, the situation is more complex than Russia bad and Ukraine good. Something the general public fails to understand, due in large part to the biased and dishonest coverage from the corporate media. But whatever you think, who the good and the bad guys are, I believe Canada should not have gotten involved in this war. We should have remained neutral and worked with our allies to help establish a peace process. That's what I have been saying since the beginning of the conflict. On the contrary, as you all know, Justin Trudeau's government, with the support of the NDP and also Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, has been sending weapons and aid worth about $4 billion to the Zelensky regime. There are few basic reasons why we should never have been involved. First, Ukraine is not a NATO member. We have no responsibility to defend it. There are dozens of conflicts taking place around the world at any given time. Ask yourself, why don't we ever hear about these conflicts from the corporate media? Why is the globalist political establishment so intent on escalating the conflict in Ukraine? We have no responsibility to intervene in foreign conflicts involving countries that are not part of an alliance or not part of NATO with us, and where we have no fundamental interest. Our first responsibility is to defend Canada, our country. Ensure our security and protect Canadian interests. That's all. That's it. We cannot solve the whole world's problem. We cannot. We need to solve our problems first and use our limited resources to take care of our own citizens first. Like Jordan Peterson said, clean your proverbial room before you save the world. And frankly, what difference does it make to us if the corrupt Ukrainian government or controls the Donbass and Crimea? No difference at all. These regions have been under various jurisdictions over the past decades and centuries. Some people say that Putin is the new Hitler, and that if we don't stop him in Ukraine, he will invade the rest of Europe and possibly even Canada. They accuse me of being a contemporary Neville Chamberlain who naively thought he could appease Hitler. That's a nonsense. You know it. The Russian economy is about the same size as the Canadian economy. Russians is barely able to keep control of the few territories populated mostly by ethnic Russians that it conquered. It has no ability whatsoever to invade and occupy NATO countries, and its army will be quickly destroyed if it tries. Are we defending democracy in Ukraine? Not really. Ukraine is an unstable country and far from a model democracy. There was a coup in 2014 that removed a pro-Russian president. Zelensky banned all pro-Russian opposition parties just earlier this year. Some people have been telling me that I should actively support Ukraine because, and listen that, because there are 1.4 million Canadians of Ukraine descent. What kind of argument is that? There are Canadians of all ethnic backgrounds. Does it mean we should get involved in every conflict in the world and support the side that has the largest representation among ethnic groups in Canada? It's just absurd. So, Canada's foreign policy should be based on Canada's national interests. Not on the loyalty of some Canadians for the country where they or their ancestors came from. So, how did we get here? How did we become a co-belligerent in this war against Russia? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his minority Liberal government, with no dissent from the opposition benches, have charged Russia as the aggressor for invading Ukraine on February 24th. They have made Russia an enemy of Canada despite ample evidence by independent observers in the United States and also in Europe that Moscow is not solely responsible for the outbreak of this war. This is reckless and irresponsible and has undermined Canada's long-standing reputation as a peacemaking and a peacekeeping needle power on the international stage. That's our reputation. That must be our work. And peacemaking requires considering the real concerns, threats, and security interests of the parties in conflict without prejudging the issues or demonizing one party while supporting the other. Let's take a moment to look at this from a Russian perspective. First, I want to make it clear, very clear, that I have no sympathy at all for Vladimir Putin. No matter what the CBC says, I'm not a Russian asset. Putin is a brutal tyrant who has imprisoned and very likely killed some of his political opponents and censors his country's media. His values are not mine, but that doesn't mean he is crazy and that his arguments should be entirely dismissed. According to him, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or the special military operation, as he calls it, was in response to Russia's worsening security situation. This resulted from the eastward expansion of NATO and the fact that NATO troops and missiles were moving ever closer to the Russian border. This eastward expansion was described as an existential threat to the Russian Federation on numerous occasions, as in the 2007 Munich Security Conference, when President Putin expressed his concern to the Western world. Let me quote the words of George Kennan, who warned us against NATO expansion. Kennan was a diplomat, historian, and served as U.S. ambassador in Moscow during Soviet era. He was also the father of the containment policy the West adopted, directed at the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In response to the vote in the U.S. Senate in May 1998 approving NATO's expansion eastward following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kennan said, and I quote, "I think It is the beginning of a new Cold War. It is tragic. It is a tragic mistake. No one was threatening anybody else. I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then those who support NATO's expansion will say that we always told you. That is how Russians are. But this is just wrong. That was George Kennan nearly a quarter century ago predicting what might happen. We know what happened since then. In 2014, a coup took place in Kiev that removed an elected pro-Russian president from office with the help of the Obama administration. In response, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which, by the way, had been given to Ukraine by Soviet government only in 1954 and was populated mainly by Russians. Since then, there have also been conflicts in the Donbass, Ukraine's eastern region, also populated mainly by ethnic Russians. It's very hard, I must admit, to have an objective description of the situation right now. But I've read that Ukraine adopted laws that discriminated against ethnic Russians, that some of these Russian Ukrainians, perhaps encouraged by Russia, wanted to separate Ukraine and join Russia. The neo-Nazi Ukrainian military units persecuted ethnic Russians, and that region was bombarded, killing many people. According to independent observers in Ukraine, such as the Swiss military intelligence officer Colonel Jacques Beau, Ukrainian shelling of the Donbass was increased fourfold in the middle of February 2022, while some 50,000 Ukrainian troops by the end of 2021, where these troops were deployed in the southern part of the country in preparation for a spring offensive. I'm sure if you had a debate here today between pro-Ukraine and pro-Russian experts, you could add many more reasons to blame one side over the other. But my point is that we almost never hear the Russian side of the story, since all Western governments and almost all Western media explicitly support Ukraine. We hear a lot in the Western press about Putin's speeches when he says Ukraine is not a real country, that the fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster for Russia, and that he wants to bring back Russia's former glory as a world superpower. These are probably part of his motivation to attack Ukraine. But why do we never hear about the shelling of the Donbass by Ukraine and about the Russian perspective that they had to assist the ethnic Russians in that region, and about the Russian fear of being encircled by NATO? Are we absolutely sure that Russia is entirely to blame and that Ukraine is only a victim? I'm not so sure. This past October marked the 60th anniversary of the Cuba Missile Crisis that brought the United States and the former Soviet Union to the brink of a nuclear confrontation. That was in 1962. It was avoided and a de-escalation followed because the leaders of both countries, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, recognized the heavily burden placed upon them in the nuclear age. They understood that war between nuclear powers is insanity and that there cannot be any excuse for a just war in the age of the nuclear weapons. No American president then or since would accept such a threat to American security as the missiles in Cuba posed, and President Kennedy was driven to take measures to have those missiles removed immediately. Similarly, no Russian leader would accept or allow that a country on its borders as close as Cuba or Mexico are to the US be turned into a NATO platform for conventional or nuclear weapons pointed at Russia. How is it that our first and most urgent responsibility in securing peace in a nuclear age has been put aside? And instead, we are witnessing how recklessly the West has raised the stakes over Ukraine by disregarding the warnings from Moscow. The West deliberately disregarded Russia's red line, as the former Soviet Union did in disregarding the American red line by installing missiles in Cuba. In the 1990s, there was thought that Russia might one day become a member of NATO. President Putin himself did not rule out this possibility in 2000. But instead of listening to the other side and taking steps to reassure the Russians, we blew it and made enemies of them. And we pushed them in the arms of the Chinese. The drastic financial sanctions against Russia have also encouraged many countries from the emerging South to distrust the West even more. The organization of BRICS countries is expanding, and these countries, including Russia, India, and China, are working on the launch of a new world reserve currency, probably backed by gold. That will make them more financially independent from the US and its daughters. These countries represent 80%, yes, 80% of the world's population. When the dollar collapses as the world's reserve currency, the US will lose its status as the sole superpower. The West is not the old world. On the contrary, it is becoming increasingly isolated. We are moving from a unipolar world dominated by the US to a multipolar world with other emerging powers. Supporting Ukraine is not helping the West. It is pushing the rest of the world into a coalition against us. But we understand we are neighbors to the US, completely dependent on them to defend our continent, and our economies are closely interrelated. Realistically, we have no choice but to be in their camp. But we don't need to follow them in every one of their reckless foreign military interventions. Here, let me recall the words of Lester B. Pearson as Secretary of State for External Affairs in the Liberal government of Premier Minister Louis Saint Laurent. At the signing ceremony of the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. on April 4, 1949, he said, and I quote, "This treaty is not a pact of war, but a pledge for peace and progress." End of quote. The North Atlantic Treaty, according to the Canadian government at the founding of NATO, was designed to meet the security challenges of the Cold War in the divided Europe and at the end of the World War II. That's why we decided to sign that NATO treaty. But after the end of the Cold War, the treaty became twisted into bringing together NATO members under US command in supporting regime changes and wars in the Balkans, in Serbia over Kosovo, in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, in Georgia, and Ukraine. Canadian governments under both Liberal and Conservative prime ministers, however, have demonstrated on occasions reluctance or opposition to joining such coalitions when it was unclear whether the proposed missions were in Canada's best interest. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien rejected Canada's participation in the Iraq War of 2003 because he said there was no Security Council authorization giving for the use of military force against Iraq. Similarly, Prime Ministers Pearson and Pierre Trudeau never entertained any notion of lending military support to the U.S. for the Vietnam War during the height of the Cold War era. Never. Canadian leadership helped defuse the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. Instead of pouring fuel on the fire, as the government of Canada has been doing in the present crisis in Ukraine, we must do like we did in the past. And like Prime Minister Brian Mulroney did also when he withdrew Canada's military presence entirely from Europe. On July 10, 1993, the last batch of Canadian Armed Forces personnel left Europe. It is evident that the current government in Ottawa and all members of our Parliament have forgotten our history and our tradition of peacemaking and peacekeeping through the Cold War period and after. Our role right from the outset of the Ukraine war should have been that of a peacemaker. We should have remained faithful to our tradition of peacemaking and helped de-escalate this conflict. Even with the little influence we have, instead of helping keep the war going and being partly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. It is not too late to change direction if more Canadians understand what is at stake. But there is work to be done to make sure Canadians understand, and we are doing that work. In Canada today, our political discourse is very narrow. The corporate media smears and discredits anyone who offers a decent perspective to the mainstream narrative. There's no opposition in Parliament, but we are fighting back. Rebel media and other independent journalists, the People's Party, myself, and our candidates across the country, we are willing to tell the other side of the story. We are willing to share and debate ideas that the establishment has deemed forbidden. We will not be silenced. We will never be afraid to advocate for common sense ideas on behalf of Canadians. You can count on us. I can count on you. I want to thank you very much. Stay strong and free. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Maxime Bernier, ladies and gentlemen. Now, folks, most of our speakers are going to be available for a short Q&A session. I think there's a microphone down there if you can line up, and if you can limit your questions to just one so we can accommodate as many people as possible. So if you have any questions for Mr. Bernier, please come along. While we're setting that up, I got to tell you, every time I see Maxime Bernier, I am reminded of my favorite Star Trek episode.
Oh my God.
Seriously. It's from the original series. It's called The City on the Edge of Forever. And you might remember it's the one where Dr. McCoy goes back in time to New York City circa 1930. And somehow, some way, he changes history. There is no United Federation of Planets. There is no Starship Enterprise. And Kirk and Spock have to follow Dr. McCoy back in time and somehow restore the timeline. And I thought, you know, if we could actually bend the time-space continuum, and we could go back to 2017, to the Conservative Party of Canada Leadership Conference, and instead on the 13th ballot, by a margin of 2%, I stand corrected. I must be from a different timeline. 1%, if somehow we could have had a real Conservative win as opposed to Mr. Andrew Scheer, I personally believe that in the 2019 election, Justin Trudeau would have been toast. That would have been our timeline. No. Imagine that. A Conservative as the head of the Conservative Party of Canada. Well, we can dream, can't we? In the meantime, set your phasers on fun. See what I did there? Anyway, Sheila, do we have our first person for a question?
Do we have the mic on? Okay, perfect. I was going to sound the nerd alert there, David. There's a way you could have told that story without being such a dork.
Hi, Max. My name is Randy Williams. I'm from Kitchener, Ontario. My question is, in the present danger of China, where we're training their military in winter warfare, setting up police stations in our country, if you become Prime Minister, will you take a hard stand against China?
The answer is yes. That's it. You know.
Thank you so much.
Hi there. I was just wondering, in case there's anyone here from Mississauga, could you tell us a little bit about Khalid, who's running in the by-election in December?
Yes, we have a by-election in December. That will be December 12th. And yes, we have a candidate there for the People's Party of Canada. That's a tough riding. As you know, it's a Liberal riding. But we want to be there. We want to give an option, an opportunity for these voters to vote for their values, for what they believe. And we have a great candidate. I'll be with him next weekend in the region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Maxime. My name's Clayton Demain. I'm a student journalist from Oshawa. I was wondering if as Prime Minister, you can commit to never supporting a war that didn't directly threaten Canada.
So a war that what?
Sir, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, so would you ever as Prime Minister, would you ever bring us into a war that didn't directly threaten the security of Canada?
Yeah, that's what I said in the speech, you know. It's not our war. We don't have to be there. We don't need to be there. We need to do what we did in the past, in our tradition, in our history. So the solution for what is happening in Ukraine right now is just to get out of that and do like Lester B. Pearson did at that time to promote peace and security. That's the role of our country. We are a middle power. We're not a big country like the US or China, but we have a role to play. And that's what it's too bad that there's no opposition in Ottawa against that war. And yes, we must be out there and tell these establishment politicians that must end that. And actually, they're sending money that we don't have over there. You know, $4 billion, we don't have that. Let's bring back that money here to help Canadians first.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Fred from Aurelia. Max, I was there the night that Andrew Scheer flipped the thing out, and you told me last summer that was a staged event. But my question is regarding Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. What do you know? What can you tell us? How can we ensure that this guy's authority never really gets to our shores? And how did they get to this place whereby he clearly admits they have infiltrated the cabinets of almost every country in the world, including our pretty boy in Ottawa and his shaloos, or his shellacks. What's your take on the World Economic Forum, and what can we as freedom fighters do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, we are a sovereign country. We just have to stand up and say no to the World Economic Forum, to the UN also. I said the UN is a dysfunctional organization. And so that's, if you fight for your country, that must be what you must do. But actually, some people are saying, you know, the World Economic Forum is not that influential here in Canada. But just remember, we had that vaccine passport apps arrive Canada. That was under the idea of the World Economic Forum. And that's why Trudeau decided to implement that in our country. So you can count on us. We are fighting against that. We will always fight for Canadians. And not only the World Economic Forum, but also the World Health Organization, the UN, and all these globalists. And actually, if you YouTube me on the debate that I did, I was able to be on the stage in the election of 2019. At the last election, 2021, they didn't want me on the stage. They created a new rule saying, you know, Maxime cannot be there. But I was debating with these leaders in 2019, and I said we had a section on the sovereignty of our country, and I said that all these leaders on the stage are globalists, and I'm not one. My goal is to fight for Canadians, for our sovereignty, for our country first. So thank you for asking.
Hi, my name's Jeff from Toronto. And with all due respect to all those lives that have unfortunately been lost in the Ukraine and Russia, did anybody ever figure out how it is that Trudeau and Freeland were able to know that the Ukraine wasn't going to get bombed when the number one and number two went there together at the same time? That was a little bit anecdotal, but what's your comment on the magnitude of dollars that are being sent to the Ukraine? Because it's not just that it's a large amount of money that we can't afford, it's beyond any amount that's being spent on the military. That much money doesn't go to Israel or to any other countries that we support.
I believe that the government is able to do that because they have the support of the public opinion, the majority. That's why I said in the beginning of my speech that we have another mass hysteria. Propaganda from the mainstream media is very efficient. That was very efficient during COVID-19. They were able to have the majority on their side because they use fear and propaganda. And now with Ukraine, they're using the same logic. And so that's why they have people, Canadians on their side. And because of that, Trudeau is able to do that. And because of that also, you don't have any opposition in Ottawa because all these establishment leaders are doing politics based on survey, polling, and focus group. They are all opportunists. They don't do politics by conviction. And for us, the difference with them is if it's popular or not, we don't care. We don't care. I was there in the beginning of the pandemic in May 2020. And yes, at that time, we were a French minority, but with acceptable views for us. And we were able, together with the Rebel News, with the journalists, with the Freedom Convoy, with the Freedom Fighters, to shift the majority. And after the Freedom Convoy, we had a majority of Canadians on our side. And that's why we were able to win that fight. And that's the same thing that we must do with Ukraine and all these files. We must be out there, speak with people, convince them, and having a good discussion like I had today, why we must not be part of that war. And I believe that we will win the argument if we are able to debate. And that's why, like Ezra said in the beginning, censorship is everywhere. We need independent media. And I want to thank you for supporting them. We need another voice. And that's, we have the best ideas and the best vision for this country. We just need to be out there and debate and having discussion with our friends, our family, our co-workers about the situation. Yes.
And by the way, if I can interrupt, thank you very much, Maxime. One more question, folks, just to keep things on the rails. I'm sorry about that for those who lined up, so please ask your question.
But anyway, I'll be here all day long with you, so you can come with me, and if you have other questions, I'll be able to answer them. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Bernier, thank you so much from all of us for the depth of your understanding and your support of Canadians. My question is, do you think there's any reason to be hopeful that a Trump presidency would bring the West back towards tradition, truth, common sense? Would it help?
There's always hope. There's always hope, and we have the ability to make sure that what we believe will be the reality. And I understand that, it's a tough time for everybody, that war, the inflation, the recession, the depression that may come. But I believe, yes, if we stick to our values, our principles, there's hope in the US, there's hope here in Canada. And I believe that, we will win that debate. Common sense will always win. I don't know when, but we will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sir Maxime Bernier.
Thank you.